Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Riffhard podcast. My guest today is a good friend of mine and longtime Riffhard community member, Mr. Nizar Osmani. I'll say he's not just a member, but we've also worked with him because he's such an amazing musician, on par with, I'd say, any of the well-known famous musicians we all love in the prog metal scene. Now, by profession, he's actually an ER doctor, and he chose to become an ER doctor after completing a music degree. And I guarantee you that if he were to quit medicine for whatever reason, like if he got sick of the fulfilling side of saving people's lives every single day and decided to do something less important like music, he would become a famous musician within a year. He's as good or better than every single person I know who is at that top tier. And as a matter of fact, he's so good that when Riffhard did the Zakk Wylde Berserker Guitar Camp, that was the course we did with Zakk Wylde in 2022, we needed covers recorded of the songs that Zakk was going to teach because we couldn't use the original master recordings. Nizar not only learned all of the 7 songs that we featured on the course, but he did them all in a week, and he recorded every single instrument. And I don't mean that he like programmed the drums and stuff. Like he played the drums, he played the bass, played the guitar, and this was all figured out by ear to the point where, you know, this was kind of intimidating to send Zakk Wylde covers of his own songs played by somebody else. I mean, just think about that. You've got one of the most legendary guitar players on earth, and you're sending him a cover version of his own guitar parts. It's intimidating, but even Zakk was blown away by it. He thought it sounded great. And to me, that is one of the best compliments I could possibly give anybody. And in trying to make the case for Nizar belonging on this podcast and being on par with all of the people we bring on, regardless of the fact that he's not a famous musician, he should be. And famous musicians agree with me. Dude is fucking great and a great guy. Musical encyclopedia. I'm gonna stop this verbal massage and let's get into the episode. Here goes. Nizar Osmani, welcome to the Riffhard podcast.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
It's a pleasure, man. I've wanted to have you on for a while just because the videos that you were making and posting in the Riffhard group caught my attention. And then we became friends and have worked together on a few things. And you're a super busy person. So it's been kind of tough to line up the schedules, but wanted to do this for a while. And I'm glad that we finally can. And I wanted to talk to you about some stuff that I think is relevant to everybody. First and foremost, music isn't like your career. You're a doctor, and that, as everybody knows, is an incredibly time-consuming, energy-consuming, all-encompassing career choice. Yet somehow you're managing to keep up with music. Like you've told me that since August, you've written like something like 200 song ideas or something like that. Like not full songs, but like a lot of stuff. And somehow you're keeping up with music. And one of the things that I find with URM and Riffhard members is that they're constantly saying that they don't have time to commit. They don't. And I really do understand what it's like to be time crunched. It's hard for me as well. But if you can do it, lots of people can do it. But I want to find out a little more about how do you actually day to day keep up with it, given the intensity of your career?
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I'll start by saying, I know we've been talking about having this conversation for a while. And I mean, we've kind of talked about it, me and you throughout the last couple of years. So it's cool to be doing it in this capacity now. But, essentially, the way I approach balancing the things that I do, first off, I'll say, it's something I started doing very early on as a kid, and a lot of people, who grew up taking music lessons, or doing any kind of extracurricular activity, will be in this position where, you as a kid, you're learning to balance, your school duties and your extracurriculars or your sports or anything like that. And I think that's kind of where the seed, is first planted, and like where you first kind of start developing this this skill to balance things in this way. But for me, I feel like I kind of took it a step further, because I got to the college level with music, and I did go into university, wanting to do medicine. And my choice of going to I went to University of Miami for my initially for a biology degree. I chose that school specifically because of its music school initially, and having and I figured I would learn by osmosis. I would just be around the right people, and I would make friends there, and which is true. All of those things did happen, but a semester in, I realized that you can actually choose to study whatever you want, at least in if you're going into medicine, as long as you take the classes that are required to take the entrance exam for medical school and go on with that. So I think that was kind of the first point where I feel most people would branch off into one career or another, and I kind of was stubborn. And I was like, I want to do the music degree. I want to get to a professional level in music, but I still want to hold on to the medicine, and that's what I wanted to do as a career. And what I found was that the two things, although from a time perspective, they both had their own demands, and it could be difficult to fit the hours, from a literal how many hours in the day do you have to do XYZ standpoint. It was difficult, but in every other sense of looking at it, it actually helped, having these two different, very, very different things that were both pretty demanding, kind of fed into each other, because I like to say the enemy of productivity is burnout. And I think we hit a point where we get diminishing returns in anything that we put our effort into a lot sooner than we realize. And when you have the demands of something else pulling you towards the other thing, you're kind of forced to switch tasks and switch disciplines before you even have the opportunity for that burnout to set in. And that's been something really important. Yeah. And especially now, the career that I'm in, particular in medicine, I'm in emergency medicine. I'm actually in residency. I'm training to be an ER doctor. Emergency medicine as a field has the highest burnout rate of all specialties in medicine. And, a lot of that has to do with, we're dealing with a lot of people, a lot of our patients are coming in on the worst days of their lives, and you're dealing with emotional burden of that on top of, our collapsing healthcare system in the US, and most recently, the pandemic and the public's response to that. And, all of those things stacked together have made it a very challenging, job. And that leads to a lot of physician burnout, a lot of people, not enjoying their work. But I can confidently say that, especially, since having joined Riffhard, which I did while I was still in medical school, actually, and up until now, having this high level of music in my life, and both from a professional standpoint and from a just a personal satisfaction standpoint, I can confidently say I could never say I felt burned out in either of those things. And even up until now, all the things that we've gone through, I still feel like if I had ever gotten close to the point where I would burn out in one of those things, I had 100 other things that are demanded of me, and the other thing to keep me, to kind of ward that away.
That's an interesting way to look at it, because, as you were saying that, I was thinking about how it works for me. And I've noticed that when I'm doing anything, like I could sit there for 12 hours, and work on something. But in all reality, is not 12 focused hours. Like, for instance, when I sit down to write music, once I get past the warming up phase, brushing off the creative cobwebs, it's like an hour to 90 minutes of like intense, great work. And then after that, it just kind of starts to diminish. And I could sit there and keep pushing and burning out that creative muscle. Or I could switch to doing something else, one of the 100 other things I have to do. And I've noticed that when I pay attention to that, what is like my, I guess, creative limit or productive limit for anything. If I respect that, that's when I am able to do like guitar practice, URM stuff, Riffhard stuff, songwriting, like human interaction, like all the stuff I have to do. And I've also noticed that with ultra focused sessions, you can get a lot more done in a much shorter period of time than people really realize. I think yes, it takes years and years and years, of course, to get great at anything. But I do want to challenge the notion of how many years it has to take. Like, I think that in most cases, you can shave off like 25% of the amount of time it takes you to get great or more if you just if you were more regimented and specific and intentional about how you approach things. That's so like, for instance, at Riffhard, when, like, if you remember, I wasn't running the schedule at one point in time, that back when I wasn't playing. And when I started playing again, I took over the schedule basically to give myself a way to get better quickly, a way to like give myself some sort of a structure to get like a lot better in a short period of time while still balancing everything out. And I noticed that by also doing that, it kept me from burning out on it, because, this is the amount I'm spending on it, and that's that.
Yeah. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised too you're a very busy person, and although, they're all related, you have a lot of different responsibilities and things that demand your attention. I mean, this podcast being one of them. So I wouldn't be surprised if that also played a role in I feel like being busy and just having a lot of things demanded of you, subconsciously you recognize, you feel this pressure and which drives you to focus in ways that you probably wouldn't be able to do on command. And that especially is true for me. I have a really, really hard time focusing on anything for a prolonged period of time. But if I know, whether it's actively or passively, that my time is limited, or that there's something else demanding me, in the near future, it drives us to just attain this level of focus and productivity that I don't think willpower alone would do. Like, you almost need to have this external pressure.
Yeah, totally. It's like this extra power level in your brain that can can only be activated by real life.
Yeah. And that's something that actually joining Riffhard and doing the initial starting, to do those King of the Riff briefs, that was one of those moments where I recognized that, wow, like having a brief, having a deadline is really, really helpful, and really helps you, helps drive you to get to an end goal, where, sitting down and trying to force yourself to do it just because, you have that goal for your own personal goal, it might not get you to that same result.
Not good enough.
And I think, one of the things that I've gotten out of that is trying to simulate that, trying to set up your own type, sort of simulating an external driver, to get you to attain whatever you're trying to do, whether it's, write music or anything else. But it's pretty difficult. I think it's much easier having either a responsibility that you owe, or a brief, or professional responsibility or task. I think that makes things much, much easier. That's why I think, being in a community, that has those kinds of norms where you're kind of expected to do those things, whether they're, for a competition like King of the Riff, or just, the pressure of, and I use pressure very loosely, but, the pressure of being in a virtual online community where people are sharing music. You feel some sort of pressure to join in and do that. And in reality, that's pretty much what music school is. And what university is as a whole. Higher education is paying your way to being part of a community where there are other like-minded people as well as experts that you can learn from. And that's pretty much exactly what's going on with Riffhard online and with the community on there.
Yeah, because I mean, at the end of the day, I didn't finish my music school degree, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing. Like, you're still going to have to go home and sit there and do the work. Like,
no, exactly. And
there's no way around that part of it.
Yeah, and to highlight that too, my wife did, she studied abroad in Scotland, and the university system there, from what she tells me, is a lot more traditional in the sense that, in the U.S. we've sort of shifted towards having, you go to university, you go to college because that's what you do. That's after you finish high school, you're expected to go and you're expected to get the degree because some job requires that, right? That's like that's what we're told. But university, classically, I mean, we're talking like 200 years ago. The college university system was you pay for the opportunity to basically be in the presence of an expert in a field. And they're not obliged to teach you. There's no no one's rating their skills as a teacher. You're paying for the privilege of being among those people and among those experts. And then it's on you. It's on your own. It's totally up to how determined you are and how dedicated you are to get what you can out of that. And so in a way, I feel like what's going on with Riffhard is actually more reflective of what higher education was initially was sought out to accomplish, in that every month you have somebody who is an expert at what they do and is successful at what they do, and you have a community of people who are dedicated to who are there willingly to try to improve themselves and get as much as they can out of those experts, as opposed to I'm here, put the information in my brain without without any sort of this is what I'm expected to do. So I think there's a huge difference in that, and I think to tie everything we've been talking about kind of together, I mean, that's that external pressure. That's that you're putting yourself in that sort of environment where you're surrounded by people who have those goals, and that drives you, and you feed off of each other, and it's a beautiful thing.
That pressure. Like you said, you can try to simulate it, but it's very difficult. It's the same reason. It's like the same reason for why a touring band will always smoke a local band. Even if the local band is more talented, a touring band will always smoke them because they have gotten so used to playing under the pressure of playing live, and they're so adept at playing with adrenaline coursing through their system, and having their motor skills degraded, and all the shit that comes along with being in fight or flight mode. A touring band does that every single day, and you cannot simulate that pressure. Like, there's nothing you can do to put yourself in that state of mind. You can't fake it. And just like for me, for instance, a lot of people like me, there's nothing internal that's important enough for me to push myself. Like, I don't care about myself that much. And like, I'm not into hobbies. Like, I kind of could give a shit. I don't know how to, I'm not trying to sound negative. It's just, I know what drives me, and it always has to be something outside of myself and like greater than myself. It always has to be for like a purpose beyond me. Like if it's just for me, like I said, I could give a shit less, or couldn't give a shit less. And so having external pressure is everything. A deadline is everything. Like having somebody else expecting something from me is everything. Knowing that something is going to be released to the world, like all that stuff that makes it real, is what unlocks that for me. If I had like just no nothing except for a guitar, time, and nothing to do with it, I probably wouldn't play that much. And a lot of people asked me in my time in my hiatus, well, don't you ever just do it for fun? And like, don't you just do it to like chill? It's like, no, I don't understand that. I don't relate to that. Like there always had to be something driving it.
Yeah, and you know, and it's particularly hard with creative arts to get in that state as a whole, right? Like, because nobody needs you to make music, right? Like nobody needs you to do any of this stuff. So it's really hard to find that external that deadline, that pressure, to be in a situation where you have that, because in reality, no one needs art to survive, right? Nope. And it's easy for my other job for medicine. What are my motivations for being as best as I can? Is it can be a life or death thing, and it's impacting other people's lives in very tangible ways, and that drives, that scares you, and that makes you dedicated to being as best as you can at what you do, and not. You don't want to live with the fact that you made a medical decision error based on like incompetence because you weren't dedicated enough to learn those things. That's horrible. But when it comes to music, nothing's going to change in the world. If you do music or not, unless it does, right? Unless you're putting out music that is changing.
But you can't count on that.
You can't
count on that. That's so far outside. First of all, that's far outside the norm for that to ever happen. We hear about it because it happens, but like the statistical probability of that being you or anyone or anyone you kind of know, it's weird. I've thought about this a lot. Is that sometimes I forget that I have a bubble around me of hyper successful musicians, and I just get used to it. It just is my norm, and I need to remind myself this is not the norm at all. Like this is not the norm. This is like, I'm talking to a bunch of outliers. The norm is to not make an impact and to do it because you love it. And so, I've thought about that with you too. It's like how, like what you do for a living actually matters, like in a very, very real sense. Like at the end of the day, like you said, you are dealing with life or death. Like someone could literally die if you fuck up, or even if you don't fuck up, they could die. So it's a whole other scale of significance. And of course, I know that there are music fans who will tell you that you saved their life from it. But it's a very abstract thing. Like when a music fan tells you that, like, you helped me through a dark time, I wouldn't be here without your music. Like, I know that they're being serious, but I also don't know I don't know how to interpret it. And it's not as, I'm not saying it's not real, but I'm saying
it's not as tangible. It's not a tangible
as like, there's a patient right there. And I don't think that like the music writer has any, it's not like you're not writing a song hoping that, or thinking about someone you've never met being affected by it so it's, I don't know, it's hard sometimes to put any meaning or importance on it. That was one of the reasons that I actually quit music for a while, was it just seemed really stupid. It just seemed pointless and stupid.
But what I will say though is to kind of defend the music for play the other role a bit here. I think what we do in medicine is the lowest thing on the hierarchy of needs, right? Like in terms of what people need. You know, you need oxygen. You need to be able to breathe. You need to be able to eat and go to the bathroom. And those are the sorts of things we're dealing with. You know, the your basic bodily functions but why do we have those bodily functions? Like what's the purpose of maintaining those things, and why are we alive, and where we, and then when we start asking those sorts of questions, then I feel like that's where the realm of, the art starts to matter, and like the reason why people care about being alive is so that they can experience things like, love and relationships and their families and art, that's, and I think they need, what we do in medicine in order to be able to do those things, but those things are higher on the, on the pyramid, right? Like once you've got that foundation, your body works. In a way, it is the most important thing, but in another way, it's the least important thing. And in that way, I think musicians like us, and other musicians, should take pride in the fact that people feel the value. People want to live so that they can be around to experience something that we all contribute to. And I think that's where the intersection between those two things happens. Where it's like on the surface, one thing is way more tangible, way more literal. Like you can't eat or drink. That's a huge problem. But if
just a little,
yeah. So, but I mean, in the end, it's like if that's all you've got, you've got functioning organ systems, right? Like what does that actually afford you other than just existence? And I think that's where our what we do as musicians, I think, is finds its importance. And I think where we are in history and as a society today, I mean, we're having people are having less access to healthcare. People in general are trending towards unhealthiness, and there's an increasing wealth gap in the United States. And I think more and more what's happening is people are losing that base of their pyramid, and they're hanging on to those things, and those things start to seem a lot more important and like what you have to live for.
Well, they're pressing.
They're pressing. Yeah. So things like art start to matter a lot less. We defund art in schools. We don't value music education and art education, and because we need people to do math and science so that we can, keep the world running at a basic level. But really the height of when we talk about the Greeks and the Romans, we don't talk about we do talk about their scientific and and technological advancements, but really what we associate mostly with them is their art, their literature, and their architectural styles and things like that. And it's like the things that people remember aren't, how did they deal with, cholecystitis and in ancient times.
I think it's a very, very similar thing to the military service idea, because I've known a few people who have felt super guilty for not serving in the military. And, there is a group of people who feel like they should have done it for whatever reason, or like they just feel guilty that they didn't. But then my response to that is always, well, let's just say that you did join. Why are you joining? Like, obviously you feel like you need to protect something or defend something, or there's something you want to uphold. Like that's why you feel guilty, because you feel like you didn't do your part in that. But what is it exactly that you are trying to uphold? And it's all the stuff that does make life good and does keep life going. Without that stuff, what is there to even protect?
Exactly. Like, what are you protecting? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You're not protecting anything. So that stuff is just as important. So actually, since coming back to music, this is how I see it, how we're talking about it now. The reason I stopped was because I couldn't bring myself to see that. But during the time off, and like really through the experience of doing URM and Riffhard and all that, it just, the importance of it, like, I just see it very, very differently. I see it as much more important because really, look, at the end of the day, if all you have is survival, I mean, clearly you do need that. But what is life without things that give it meaning? What, like, really, it's pretty empty. Pretty empty.
No, absolutely.
Pretty
Yeah,
empty
yeah.
and depressing without meaning.
Yeah. But, and I will say, with as far as like the meaningfulness of the music that, the work that you're doing, like you were saying before, it's very rare. It's very hard to be in that very, very small subset of people whose music will actually have or any art will have a tangible difference on the world, even when you're alive. I mean, if you look at your Van Gogh and your Beethoven, people who died poor, they never lived to know the influence of their art in the world. And I think so it takes a very special kind of person to produce that level of art, despite having that external validity or stimulus that we were talking about earlier. But I will say, for me, what has been a way to sort of circumvent that, because I'm not releasing music. I write because I enjoy the creative process. But what has sort of given it meaning to me is actually through education, through being in the group. I recognize that there are things that I'm doing, that I'm, skills that I've gained over my time doing what I do in music, that, people find valuable, both from their own, artistic pursuits, and also just from an educational standpoint for them. And I think that has been one of the most rewarding, seeing an influence in something that I'm doing, which has been, the most of that has been through education, through the group. Yeah, and thank you. Well, and that's been something that's been very rewarding for me is the work that I've gotten to do with just interacting with other musicians and helping them understand, especially a lot of the more complicated music theory concepts and things like that, and kind of putting them in context of being able to write with those things, using otherwise technical stuff that you only know from a definition standpoint, and actually being able to use it and understand it in a way that lets you actually apply it to what you're doing, and seeing the results of that, and seeing people take those conversations that I've had with them and be able to turn them around and actually apply them to what they're doing has been probably more rewarding than anything else I've done in music. I mean, I've gotten to play, I've played hundreds of gigs. I've played music, I've performed music, recorded music, and the most the most gratifying thing has actually been, seeing an influence in something that I'm doing, which has been, the most of that has been through education, through the group.
I guess that is kind of cool, actually, for you to be doing that, because you're able to impact people's lives at both ends of the pyramid.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and it helps, it keeps the picture in perspective, and it also keeps me, keeps my skills sharp too. I mean, it keeps me, it gives me a reason to hold on to, doing all those things and discussing them on a regular basis at the same depth that I would have been in an academic setting. And music has been actually really, really good for me.
Yeah, I will just say that, like, those people listening to this who have heard No Rest, No End, the Goth song, Nizar actually helped me do a harmonic analysis. Well, helped me, like, you did it. Did a harmonic analysis of the middle section, like the quote unquote Baroque section, which helped me a lot in explaining it, because I then had to go film an entire walkthrough of it for Riffhard. And I just got to say, that was super, super insightful and helpful, because for me, theory, it's an interesting thing. I studied it, and I feel like I have it in my ears, and it comes out in my writing. Like sometimes it's following the rules, sometimes it's not. but it's kind of like in me, but not in a way where I can just like rattle it off. And it reminds me a lot of, so Spanish is actually my first language. And, when I was 13, I used to go to Mexico and spend the summers working at my grandfather's factory. So I'd work in an office in Mexico City for like 3 months straight. I did that like when I was 13, 14, 15, and 16. Then I'd come back to Atlanta and go to high school and take Spanish class. And literally got an F. Like I almost got held back because of my grades in Spanish class. So meanwhile, I'm going to Mexico and I'm like working in a fucking office with adults and then failing a class with people who can't put sentences together because I don't know the words for the grammar quite the same way. So like, I think I know more about music theory than I do about the Spanish grammar, proper Spanish grammar, but it's the same sort of thing where it's much more something I can just do than rattle off. So having you help me was huge.
Well, thanks so much for the kind words. I mean, that's the most I could have hoped for with that. I'm really glad it was helpful in any way. Because really it is, like you said, I mean, it's essentially what I did would have been the equivalent of like taking a paragraph in Spanish and then being like, this is the accusative and this is the predicate, like, I mean, that I feel like that's to the untrained, in music theory, looking at it from the outside. I mean, it looks like a lot of times it looks like a magic formula for quote unquote writing good, right? But the reality is an understanding of music theory is just as helpful to writing music as an understanding in English grammar is to writing literature. Like being able to label, the predicate nominative in a sentence, right? Isn't going to help you write a good sentence, and isn't going to and you probably
can know what that means.
Yeah, I think it's just all the the punctuation rules and all those things. I mean, we speak fluent English, but very few people could give you an accurate like a full grammatical analysis of a paragraph, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, maybe my English teacher and English professors in college, but like, I don't know very many people who still remember how to do that. Yet they speak fluent English. They're able to compose emails. They're able to write papers and do them better. Some do them better than others. Some do them at the world class level. I'd be surprised. I'd be curious to know how many like New York Times bestselling authors could do that. Could still do a college English style grammatical or analysis or of literary work. And I would wager that it's not that many. But for some reason in music, and I think it's because it's not as evident that that's how it is. Like in English, it's like, oh, of course I can speak. I don't need to know those things. But when it comes to music, because it's not as there's an instrument between you and the message, right? So it's a lot easier to be like, well, maybe that's what I need to know before I'm able to speak through my instrument. I need to know
a theory about this theory thing, which is the younger you start, the less you're going to be trapped into that sort of thinking. So I don't know how old you were when you started music. I know you were young. I was 3. So how old were you?
I was about 4.
Okay, so similar sort of thing. And I know that you also played multiple instruments just like I did. And so for music, the language of music is just, there's the language I spoke, English, Hebrew, Spanish, but then there's this fourth language I grew up with, music. And so the theory side of it was always just a supplement to this language that I knew how to speak. And I think that people who pick it up later in life, meaning even in their teenage years, so that's what I mean by later in life. I don't mean like when they're 40. I mean like when they're not under the age of 5. I find that they, in some ways, have to do more work to like I guess, get it in their head as a language. And therefore I find that they're looking for ways they think that they need it to understand it because it's not on the language level quite yet for them. Yeah. And I would just say that, like, if you learn how to speak it like a language, you won't need you don't need to worry about theory as much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think a good analogy to that is it's comparing learning a language by dropping yourself in a country where people only speak that language and leaving you there for a few months versus taking a class where you're learning the language structure before, and then practicing in like an artificial environment, and I mean, time and time again, it's shown that, the better way to learn the language is immersion and just being there. And I think it's the same with music. If you get bogged down by the theory and the technical definitions of, what are these phrases characterized as, and as a whole, and things like that, instead of just, doing the music, I feel like you kind of achieve the same phenomenon. And actually, on that note, I mean, I would say that, in my opinion, I've found that the easiest way to quote unquote learn the language of music has been actually through improvising, being in a situation where you have a musical context, and then you on the spot you have to say something that matches that context and appropriately. You can't do that if you don't speak the language. You could probably you could be not as good at the language and kind of sit off to the side, figure out how to say something coherent, and then come back and do it. But in order to do it on the spot, as you're hearing the context in real time, that to me is the equivalent of, you're having a conversation with a native speaker.
I forget who said it, that it is the real-time manifestation of visceral musical intelligence. Forget who said that, but they were talking about improvisation.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, I would definitely agree with that, though. That's and it doesn't have to be specific to any genre or anything. I mean, just if somebody, if you're hearing some chords on a piano and you pick up whatever instrument and you're able to play notes that are consonant with what you're hearing and make sense from a music traditional standpoint in any way, then that says a lot about your ability to hear and interpret, and then you're actually listening to what you're hearing. And I think that's, it all ties together with this whole language metaphor. You're speaking a language. You're not just, you're not, when people sing in Latin, for, choral music, not, those people aren't all fluent in Latin. They're just reading off the syllables, on a piece of paper. Versus, having somebody who can actually, speak fluent Latin and improvising or saying something meaningful. I think maybe that's a bit of a stretch as an analogy, but we're both making the same point here.
I do think it's helpful. So I'll tell you a way that I use it now when writing. So, for instance, I know that I tend to gravitate towards harmonic minor, like that. I always say harmonic minor is my major scale. I know that everybody says that the major scale is the foundation of all Western music. Cool. They can say that. But for me, my ear, always harmonic minor above all. So I just see that as my major scale. I treat it as home base. And I know, though, that because of that, I just have these tendencies. When I've been writing, for a while, like I've been writing for a month, every day. And I'm starting to notice that I'm repeating ideas, which I think is natural for anyone. When you're writing a lot, you will sometimes repeat ideas. When I find myself doing that and I need to break out of that, that's when I'll do something like study some modal interchange or something, because I know that that's going to force me outside of what I would normally do. So I'm not just studying theoretical concept for the sake of appearing smart, or because I think that it's going to make me it's going to show me how to write. But what I do know is that there are certain types of things like modal interchange that by definition, it's going to break me out of my tendencies. It has to, because that's exactly what you're doing. You're going outside of what is in that scale or in that key. And so whenever I do that, then I find myself like it'll open up a whole new world of creativity. But it's usually just like study it for like an hour, and then I'm good for like a month.
Yeah, no, and I think you're really highlighting the idea of how music theory can improve your awareness. I think and of musical concepts and I think that's something. There is something to be said about that, which is to kind of tie it back to the language metaphor. Let's say you are writing, you are a proficient writer, and then you come across a literary device, like a certain kind of analogy that you can make in literature. And it's something that exists, but maybe you may have not noticed in your own reading or in the case of music listening before. And then, the theory draws your attention to it. And now you're aware of that and you can add it to your skill set because, there's nobody who will have heard everything in music that there is to be done in every style. Like there's always going to be somebody who has created a term for a musical tradition that you have not heard, or you have not noticed before. And, whether it's because it's not as common in the music you play or listen to, or you just haven't listened to enough music. There's always going to be a thing, for example, like if you go your whole life, you've only listened to what's on the radio, you're probably never gonna, you're never gonna hear like atonal music or like prominent modal interchange in the music you're listening to. I mean, I'm sure there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's not going to be something that like your ear will, that when you're writing music, the idea of like, I should give that a shot. That sounds like it would work here would ever happen. And I think that's where having a familiarity with theory, or, in other words, other people's interpretations of patterns in music that you have not noticed, can be useful as not as a tool to help you write, but but to at least expand your palette, to kind of give you more things that you are aware of that might seem like good ideas.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Like, I think that people are very intimidated by it. It's like they get either intimidated by it or they overemphasize the importance of it. But I remember, I think it was Jason Richardson saying it on one of the several podcast episodes, that he used to think it was super important till he became friends with Mark Holcomb and the Periphery guys, and realized, well, they say they don't know theory. Mark doesn't know theory, but obviously he does. Like it's like he does in his ears. Like you hear his playing and he knows his shit. Like he doesn't have it studied the way that the way that you would typically study it, but it's in him for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, and it all comes back to that concept of like, have you heard this thing before? I mean, those guys listen to music, and they listen to a lot of music, and they hear things, and it's integrated into their ears and by extension into their voice, their musical voice. And so, somebody who has that may not, reading about it and reading about modal mixture may not be of any benefit to them because they already do it, because they've heard it, and whether or not they know what it's called, whether or not they can write an academic style paper about it, doesn't really matter, because they're it's in their palate. It already exists there. So I mean, and I think that just goes to show that it's really all about what's your vocabulary, what's your palate, what tools do you have to work with, and that is completely independent of like your understanding of theory. Though if you have any deficit in any of those things, then having an understanding in theory can at least draw your attention to examples where those concepts are occurring in music that you may have heard or not heard, so that you can integrate it and write with it. And I think that's where it becomes a worthwhile thing to be aware of. And that's why, whenever I explain these things, whenever I, all my Riffhard videos and all the, when I talk about this in one-on-ones, I never talk about a concept on its own. It's always in the context of an example especially particularly if it's a commonly heard example, like if something that hey, you are already familiar with the sound. Now here's what it's called. Here's why this thing sounds cool. And now you know, and now you have it as a building block, and why it works and how it works, and hopefully you can kind of turn it around. And when you manipulate it enough times, then it just becomes innate. And you're like Mark Holcomb. You're not having to sit there and define what you're doing. It's just what you hear, and it happens on its own.
You were telling me that when you write, you're not like. I'm trying to understand it a little. Like, so you've told me that you're not thinking in terms of theory, though. Like, you just hear things and know what it is theoretically. So, like, it's not like that part of your brain is off. But like, you told me that you don't see it as two different things. But that's still when writing, your priority is: does this sound cool? Do I like this?
Yeah, that's absolutely always my priority, and really the only times I'll dig to.
Does sound cool. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, that's actually why I started paying attention to you in the first place, was because the music you were writing was actual music, and it was just cool. That got my attention.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, really, that's I mean, you're right. Whenever I'm anytime I'm writing anything, my focus is primarily on a sound. The music that I'm hearing, which isn't defined by theory terms, but I'm very fluent in that kind of thing. So I'm able to pretty much simultaneously and instantaneously talk about it in that context. Like I'm able to tell you, I mean, in the same way that, like if I tell you, I am sitting here, I can say like, oh, I is the subject of my sentence, am is the verb, I can kind of do that. And I feel like it's similar in that way. But I will also say, before I went to jazz, before I went to music school, the extent of the music I listened to was I listened to a lot of classic rock, and classical music because I played classical piano and violin, and I was in the marching band. I was playing French horn, and of course played guitar. Flamenco was actually my initial background in guitar. So I had a lot of those. I did have a kind of atypical and Western harmony understanding of some sounds to begin with, but really what expanded my musical palette was when I went to music school and started actually listening to jazz and being exposed to that music and exposed to other musicians who are versed in, who can improvise in that style and can draw on those on things like the modal interchange that we're talking about before, and harmonic substitutions and things like that, just on a whim. And I learned those things in the way that we were talking about before. I learned them by somebody saying, here's the thing, here's the theory that defines it, here's why it works. And then I retroactively, then it became ingrained in my ears, and now I don't think about it like that. But I did learn it that way. I did learn it in the way that you were highlighting before. Theory can be useful, and it's totally expanded my harmonic vocabulary, and it's made my understanding of all the things that I knew before way more profound. Like I'm able to. I feel like my understanding of those things is I'm really happy with where I got from that experience. But now, like you said, when I sit down and write, like although there was a point where that was the case, now when I sit down, I'm never thinking about anything in terms of how to define it, music theory, unless I'm explaining it to somebody else.
That makes sense. So we're starting to run out of time. There's one last thing I want to talk to you about. I feel like it would be criminal to not bring this up. So you played a pretty major role in the Zakk Wylde course we put out last year. Right now, this is 2023. We put out, for people listening in the future. So in 2022, Riffhard put out Zakk Wylde Berserker Guitar Camp. And it's a Zakk Wylde course where it is him going through his style and also going through several songs. And in order to be able to do that and go through those songs, we had to license the songs, but people who, for the quick lesson on music copyrights, is there's a copyright on the masters, meaning the actual recording, and then a copyright on the song itself. That's why, you have cover versions of a song and the person who wrote it is still getting royalties, even though the record label that owns the master which is the original recording, isn't. So anyhow, two different things. We license the songs, but there's no way you can license the masters for like No More Tears or something. It was not going to happen. And so in a very short period of time, we needed cover versions of those songs that Zakk was going to do playthroughs for and talk about and teach, but they needed to be on par with the original recordings, like, because Zakk had to be able to play to them. So it couldn't just be crappy renditions. Like, first of all, I'm just going to say Nizar fucking killed it. Like, Zakk loved the versions and was blown away, and he had a super easy time playing to it. And so thank you for not embarrassing me. But like, because I mean, dude, that was the first time we ever did anything together. So that was like a huge leap of faith for me. I'm not big on taking chances on people when there's something like that on the line, like getting embarrassed or like fucking up the Zakk Wylde course it's not high on my list of things to do. So that was a big risk. But I felt like it was a good educated guess to ask you to do it based on everything I knew about you to that point. And so I want to know a few things. Like, first of all, how nerve-wracking is it to know that like you're sending guitar? So like Nizar did rhythms and Zakk did go through the rhythms, but like we still needed the rhythm guitars recorded. So what was it like learning and recording guitars that Zakk's parts that Zakk is then going to listen to and play to and have to approve? Like, it sounds scary.
Yeah, I mean, it was there was definitely a little bit of nerve-wracking, a little bit of scariness involved, but I think the overwhelming feeling with that was it was just such a cool opportunity that the excitement of being able to participate in that was just so much, just kind of overshadowed all of that for me. And it was just, I took it very, very seriously, and I knew you were, taking a chance on me doing that, and, really, really appreciate it. Obviously that the opportunity was probably one of the coolest things I've ever gotten to do. I took it very seriously, and I did it in 10 days. I think there were 8 tracks, I believe, and
seven. It was seven tracks. Still, you did it fast.
Yeah.
And you played every instrument. I got to say that too.
Yeah. Having transcribed a lot in college, this was the first time that I'd really done it since then, and definitely way more, at a way higher level than I'd ever done it before. So it was definitely a challenge. And then the music part was actually pretty straightforward for me. I think so a lot of those songs I was already familiar with, especially the Aussie tracks, and so that was good. But there are other tracks, where, especially the ones that were really harmonic heavy, and Zakk has a really particular way of hitting his harmonics and has a really signature sound. So that was one of the more nerve-wracking things is really getting those like the rhythm guitars on Stillborn, like getting that harmonic to be the same pitch as on the record was that was one of those things that I really, really paid attention to. I think for me that the challenge, more so than learning the music, was actually the recording engineering side of things. Was choosing the right tones, using I used the same pickups, same scale length that Zakk uses, trying to find drum samples that sound similar to the record and things like that. Although we did have MIDI tracks that Joel Wanasek, who did a bulk of the engineering work, could have easily replaced any of the tones that I used. But I think we ended up using the originals, if I'm not mistaken, the ones that I had sent.
I'm pretty sure that Joel mixed what you sent and didn't replace much, but he did a fucking phenomenal job. Mix.
No, absolutely. And I mean, that's the thing that I was worried about the most was from a it's like I can play all the right notes, but to get it to sound like, getting those 80s records to sound like 80s records and getting the 90s ones to sound like, and having them sound appropriate. I think that was the big task, and that's the thing I'm really the most proud of. Is like now when I listen to those, I listen to the opening and No More Tears, and then I listen to the one we recorded. I'm like, wow, like that's pretty close, and it's close. Yeah, and it's super cool, and I those are all I listen to Zakk a lot, when like I told you, during my high school kind of classic rock era, and I learned a lot of those solos back then, and so being able to do that, and not just on the guitars, but figuring out the drums, the bass, and oh my god, the interlude section on No More Tears, like all the orchestral elements, the piano, all that was something. So,
yeah,
but it was
seriously, like pulling that together in that amount of time was very, very impressive.
Well, thanks very much, and I mean, obviously, thanks for the opportunity to do that. I mean, not many. I'm talking about this like it was like it was hard, but I feel like anybody in my shoes would have put everything they've got into it as well. That's I'm really happy with how it turned out, and especially and I will say a big part of, I don't think I would have even come close to have been able to do this if it wasn't for URM. And what I learned from the Nail the Mixes and the fast tracks and the courses on there, because I don't have a recording background, a recording engineering background, and a lot of what I learned to do was through URM for the purposes of recording myself for Riffhard and things like that. But as a result, I've learned how to engineer my own drum tones. I can record a kit now. I can tone match to some extent, and I learned even things like preparing the tracks to be able to send them out to get professionally mixed was something that I'd never done before, and I learned all through URM, and I was able to we were able to do it pretty seamlessly because I had that familiarity with those things, and I mean it was all through that resource. So I think it's immensely helpful, and for anyone who's listening who has any interest in recording their own music or recording other people's music, I still don't think there is a better resource out there for getting to a level where you can do that at comfortably. Besides that,
it's part of the thank you. It's part of the definition, in my opinion, of being a modern musician is like if you're a modern musician, there's gonna come a point where you got to record yourself. Like you don't need to be like on level with Will Putney or something, but like it's just a part of life now, that home recording is not just like hobby stuff. Like it's just a part of it. But we are just about out of time, so I want to thank you very much for taking the time to hang out. We should do this again at some point. I'd love to have you back on because I feel like there's still like about 4 hours left to this.
Yeah, this usually happens when we chat. So
yeah, it does. But thank you very much. I'm glad that we got to do this.
Of course, yeah, and thank you so much for having me, and all the opportunities, and looking forward to doing it again soon for sure.
For sure, man. Have a great one.
You too.